spontaneously. Okay, go
Okay,
ahead.
okay. The one thing that I was hoping that you would elaborate on, but then you kind of moved on, and I didn't want to go back to that, was, this um, the point that I kind of briefly made, that these encounters with groundlessness can also be scary, or they can be fear provoking. The reason why I was very interested, why I was hoping that you would elaborate on this is, well, the reason is twofold actually. The first and the most important part is that I myself had these experiences of intense fear and anxiety during a meditation for a while.
Mm.
And there was this period, that there was this point where I was contemplating whether I should pursue or maybe I should back off. And what I did was I just added more, let's say, grounding activities, in a sense of being more. I persisted with the practice, but also added more grounding experiences, in the sense of going on longer strolls, more vigorous exercise, things of that nature. And slowly it subsided, and actually it proved to be beneficial for me in the long run. But it was very unpleasant at the time being. And so that's the first reason, and the more important one. The second one is that I was actually interested in this phenomenon, and I wrote a short paper, and it's actually a part of the larger empirical study where people were asked whether they had any unpleasant experiences. And I personally became very interested in this phenomenon of the so-called dark night of the soul, this term taken from St. John of the Cross.
Mm.
So that's the reason why I was hoping I could maybe ask you to elaborate on this.
Right.
But if you think that you could maybe, add something to that, that would be really, really
Yeah.
interesting and useful and illuminating, not necessarily only for me, but maybe for some other practitioners. Because one experience that I've had is, I brought this to light during one of the Mind and Life summer schools. So there was an open mic, so to speak, for questions. And I went up and I just asked them, about this phenomenon. The teachers that were present there, I asked them about the dark night of the soul experience, and I mentioned that I had these types of experiences, and then I'm really interested in them. And after this, many people who were present actually approached me and thanked me and said that they had similar experiences but did not really feel comfortable talking about them, because they had this sense that they were doing something wrong. I think
Mm.
that this is a really important point.
Right. Yeah, no, I think this is essential too. I feel this is what happened to the Buddha when he had this big suffering come up about his existence, about, old age, sickness, and death.
Hmm.
And for me, it's why I became a monk. So this is what I want to do, because this big hole opened up inside of me in my mid 20s after I university. I worked for a year teaching English in Spain, and then I kind of dropped out of society. I met a spiritual
Hmm.
teacher, and then I felt like all this material things in the world, and career and making money, it didn't have meaning anymore. And so I started, just living out of my backpack, going from place to place, just meeting people, living with them for a week, a month, in different communities in Europe mainly. And when I went back to the States, then after a year or two of that, I just found I couldn't relate. I couldn't, I couldn't explain some of my experiences. I feel I always try to tell young people, you got to spend some time and just throw yourself on the world, because your preconceptions. I mean, we often come out of the educational system with a sense of almost an arrogant sense of how the world is structured, and all we need to do is just implement what we've learned now, and we will be happy and successful. And you know we all end up hitting a wall at some point, whether it's when maybe you never hit the wall and you never get that opening that actually where you touch the groundlessness and you feel like something is pulled out from underneath your feet, and you experience falling down. And I certainly found myself coming to meditation practice after going back to the States and finding that I couldn't really relate to people the depth of what I'd experienced living without any particular um, goal in mind or object, just trying to observe things. And that's
Mm-hmm.
when I discovered mindfulness, and I said, okay, it's like suddenly this whole tradition which is inviting you to come into that space where, as you say, you remove the rules of chess.
Uh,
You're invited to remove all the conditioning that has been inculcated in you since you were young, through the education system, through the community, through the media, through all of these mediated experiences, and instead just allow yourself to be in the space of unknowing, which, as you say, like Saint John of the Cross called the dark night of
Dark
the
Knight of
soul, and so I I even though that can be, I mean, in that time in my life was very difficult for those 2 or 3 months. I
the
mean, thank goodness my mom was very tolerant and she allowed me to stay in the house, but I was really, I thought I was going crazy actually.
yeah,
And
okay.
actually, I was just experiencing the fruit of my thinking and my speech and my actions in the past. And I started to review my life when I had the practice of mindfulness, when I could sit down and, just like you say, grounding. Just I said, okay, every morning, every evening for 45 minutes, right when I wake up and right when I go to bed, sitting
Mm-hmm.
meditation. And I would
Mm-hmm.
literally, I memorized the four establishments of mindfulness sutra, and
Mm-hmm.
I would practice it in one sitting session, the entire sutra. I would go through it, and I felt this transformation because the conditioning would was becoming softer and breaking down, and there was the invitation to be just present with what is there, and not
Mm-hmm.
have to have any other reason for it, not to have a self, not have to have a story about what I'm doing. Like I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
become a great Dhamma teacher. I'm going to study Buddhism, like Thich Nhat Hanh. I'll be like the Master Thich Nhat Hanh. I will, because you can, unfortunately, in everything in Buddhism, including, we can
Yeah.
create all kinds of really ridiculous stories about ourselves and what we're doing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but for me, the heart of it is this awareness in groundlessness, right? It's just being aware there's a body, there's breathing,
Mm-hmm.
and not
Mm-hmm.
adding anything to it. And then
Mm-hmm.
this incredible bliss can actually manifest when you're allowed that um, when you're permitted to have that experience
Mm-hmm.
by I think you need a community of support. That's what I felt when I read the sutra. It wasn't just about reading the four establishments of mindfulness sutra and putting it into practice, but it was like there's a community of people who do this, even if it's
Mm-hmm.
just a community in the past of this beautiful tradition of ancestors who have left behind their concern about fame and power and money and book contracts and whatever, and
Yeah.
have just are just wanting to look into what is going on in my body, what is going on in my mind in every moment, and experiencing this wondrous bliss, just like it's like a supernova inside, it's like the experience of the whole cosmos and the universe is happening in us, and meanwhile I'm thinking about, yeah, this mundane, like what am I going to have for lunch, or what am I going to, and that it's not that those thoughts are bad or good, but it's just that if we feel, you know I for me it was getting that permission that
Mm-hmm.
there is a community that practices. There is a sangha. We call it the sangha jewel. And
Mm-hmm.
whether the
Yeah.
sangha, at that time I didn't have a sangha around me. I was just, in my mom's house, in my room, sitting in meditation. But I knew the sangha was there, and I could feel it already in my heart. And I said, yes, that's why a lot of us experiencing it as like almost a kind of rebirth. I don't know if it's more just in American Buddhism because we're more prone to evangelical being evangelical, but for me it was a kind of rebirthing, you know, it was a kind of like that it gave me permission to not have to
Yeah,
know who I am, to not have to have a story, to not have to prove anything, but to completely
yeah,
enjoy this experience. So that's a little bit where I was, and then that gave me, you know, I suddenly felt rooted in groundlessness, as it were. You know, I
yeah.
felt like I had a path, and I didn't have
Mm,
the fear anymore. So the Dhamma was there, and whatever I did, it didn't matter that I did this. I mean, you know, after that experience, before I became a monk, I did kind of nursing. I did all kinds of things I never would have imagined doing, and I was not trained to do.
mhm.
But I was more much interested in the relationship of experience with another person, in my working or in my free time or my study, because actually, whereas before I was, you know, some part of me was had this driving kind of ambition and wanting to have a career and, you know, become a writer or whatever, you know, it is that was there. And the Dhamma just gave me this permission to say, this is really not so important. Just see if you can be present without fear. And
Yeah,
now that I'm telling you this, I never expressed it that way before, but I see it. It's like giving permission. The ancestors have given you permission to be in this
yeah,
space, and that this is actually the best use of your time in the present moment.
yeah.
So I don't know if that touches on something
It does. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah, touched on something.
when Liam asked me about, you know, my biography, I really didn't. I said it was complex, and it was complex. So I didn't really know how far to go because I, you know, kind of had this idea that there's a lot of ground that we needed to cover. So, but what you now said, I mean, that was I had a pretty similar experience. It didn't end up in my being in a monastery, apparently.
here.
But you
Something
know,
like the monastery.
to a certain degree, and it often is, given how I live often. But anyway, the what I, you know, when you said, so I started off my biographical narrative by my finding my way to Varela, but prior to that, I had like a this it lasted for several years, but it wasn't always equally intense. But it was some sort of a profound crisis, existential crisis, I would call it, what one could call it, where I had precisely this. You know, you said that once we finish with our education, you kind of go into the world with this almost like arrogant like attitude towards things. You know stuff, you know what things are like, yeah, you know. And on the other hand, you know, your everyday life, your relation to yourself, to the world, and to others is at the same time a complete mess. And for a long period of time, like there were these two narratives or images. No, one narrative about what the world is like, and of course the world was how science told me it was like. I had this period like of very profound scientism, so to speak. You know, I was actually a devout scientist in a certain sense, in a very strong sense. But on the other hand, you know, there were these everyday experiences that basically were happening and that were basically the most important aspect of my life, of course, because they were, you know, my they concerned my relationship to myself, to the world, to the others, my relationship to things that I'm interested in, what I'm interested in. And there was just like this huge gap between this, you know, formal official story about what the world is like and about, you know, what I was actually living, the reality I was living, and the this idea or the notion of what the reality is like. And there was just, you know, I couldn't do anything with these theoretical framework, with these conceptions. You know, they were completely useless for everything except for providing a narrative. And then I kind of ended in a very, very dark place at one point. Like this is why I was so interested, Liam, in your panic attacks, because I was almost crippled by anxiety and agoraphobia. It was really, really bad. For several months, I was really, really struggling with anxiety and severe form of agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is this fear of going to social places where you feel that you might not be able to get out. Okay, and this was during the winter. It was a very cold winter, I remember, and there was a lot of snow. And what I would do, I would take these long strolls, these long walks through a nearby small forest in my hometown. I live in a small town in the northeastern part of Slovenia. That's my hometown, and I was staying there at my mom's, and I would go for these long strolls, long walks. And I remember one time I was walking through the woods, and you know, I was just bombarded by these constant thoughts about things I did not want to think about. I was just flooded by thoughts and emotions and feelings or what have you. And I remember sitting on a bench of some sort. It was covered in snow. You know, I swiped away the snow and just sat on it, and there was a tree in front of me. And I sat there and I looked at the tree and I said to myself, you know, what I would just, you know, want now at this moment is just be able to watch that tree and be present with that tree. That's all I want to do. And, you know, I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it for more than 2 seconds. And this was, you know, it was a very trivial experience, but it had such a profound impact on me. Why? Because I realized that, you know, here I was thinking how smart I was, that I knew what the world was like. I was being like all progressive and liberal, and, you know, the generations before me knew nothing. And I knew what the fabric of reality was truly like. And I couldn't be there with this one tree for 3 seconds. You know, that's why usually when people ask me, you know, how did you get into meditation? I normally tell them it was meditation that found its way to me, not vice versa. Because this is when I realized the importance of meditation. I had absolutely no idea as to what meditation was at this moment. You know, I was completely clueless. But this experience told me what the essence of it was. So when I came across meditation, when I read it, it resonated, you know, immediately. Immediately knew this is it. This is precisely it. And, you know, this is something that kind of triggered this transformation. It was a, you know, slow transformation. And later on, Varela's work came about. I came across his work. And it helped me to kind of bring together some of the aspects in my life that seemed to be, you know, just on the one hand, I was becoming more and more aware of this dimension of aliveness, of lived experience, of working with, you know, what's given to me and not some ideas that I've learned, some theories that I absorbed and that actually usually had no relation whatsoever to, you know, the things that were most significant to me. And on the other hand, you know, there were valuable things that I did learn from studying science, philosophy, and so on and so forth. And, you know, but I didn't really know how to bring them together. So I was living in these like separate worlds, and it was all scattered. But it was okay, you know, I was kind of slowly learning to be okay with this mess. And then, you know, once you accept the mess, then the teacher comes along. And this is basically like Varela with this beautiful little book that kind of tries to combine cognitive science, phenomenology, and contemplative practice. And it was like, wow, I couldn't believe it. It was like, wow, you can actually do this. So, you know, this is actually a longer version and a more personal version of my biographical narrative. I didn't really want to go into at the very beginning because it seemed too long, perhaps, or maybe not particularly interesting to people. But this is, how it actually came about. This is.
Oh, I think that's a great story. I mean, that
We might
experience.
have to edit that in.
Yeah, I know. We'll leave it to Liam and his creative mind to see how this all fits together. But I just want to say this sharing over the past 20 minutes, Liam came in and out a bit, but I think it's been really.
Yeah, I figured out my computer was interfering with my phone when I had it on. That was all of the delay went away when I turned
Right.
off the electric field.
But
Oh,
anyway,
well.
some of this discussion we might want to put it in because yeah, I feel somehow it's a bit like yesterday. We're a bit more relaxed than when we think we're
Yeah,
on the, on the
I agree. I think
on the
it's a
limelight.
better dialogue when we're not really thinking about the camera that much.
Yeah. I agree with that. Definitely. I mean, when you just have, well, I think that in the dialogue itself, we also needed to warm up a little bit. That's
Yeah,
usually how
that's
it
true.
is.
Yeah.
I was going to say FetBlue is also maybe just saying something about emptiness in response to the existential, because also people learn so much. It's especially for some new students, there's always this misconceptions about emptiness, and particularly that Thai. I don't know, Sebastjan. Thai is very good at correcting misconceptions about emptiness. We talk about it as absence of like self nature, almost an absence of essence, rather than there's no meaning in life.
Yeah,
There's no inherent
this is
meaning in life.
essential. I mean, we
Yeah.
in the Buddha tradition, I think it was Nagarjuna who said that if you grasp emptiness the wrong way, you is the worst. I mean, there's no hope almost.
There's no hope for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's
and
that's
so
that's a
Thai
big.
is very careful in teaching emptiness because we do have this very strong tendency, especially in Western philosophy, towards nihilism.
Yeah, well,
And
existential angst that he's talking about
right,
is
exactly.
basically that is exactly what Nagarjuna is talking about. So I feel like
Right.
talking about that maybe a little bit would be useful,
Yeah,
like
so
for sure.
Thai often would look at a flower, and say the flower is only made of non-flower elements. Made of the sun, the earth, the rain, and it's also made, we could say, by our subjective experience of it. And so it cannot be by itself alone. It can only interbe with the whole cosmos. And so it is empty of everything. It is full, actually, of the whole universe. It is full of all non-flower elements, and there's nothing essentially flower about it. There's no self in the flower, and so it is full of everything, but is empty of only one thing, and that is a separate self. So an understanding of emptiness is actually interbeing. It's that causes and conditions that bring about all phenomena are actually making things completely full of non-it elements. And so to go deeply into emptiness, we remove this kind of need to put an essence in things that they can be by themselves alone. Nothing can be by itself alone. It can only interbe with the entire cosmos. And so when we teach emptiness, we'll always remind people of that fact because they think that there's nothing there. There's no meaning. The flower is not, there's nothing there at all, and nothing has any meaning. But it's actually touching emptiness suddenly makes everything full of meaning because in the language of what we've been learning about differencing and relating, we move from isolating the flower, as it were, as a figure, completely isolated somehow from the background, and then understand that it is only in relationship that the figure can be even understood. And so there's nothing that can be um, objectified in any way, shape, or form. It's only a figment of our imagination, our conceptualization, the act of objectification.
This it's a pity actually, yeah, that we didn't connect this to I don't know what we were thinking, but you know this is actually this is precisely this is like a really really good intersection, because if you think about what I was trying to convey today and yesterday, like the overall dynamics and the structure of the phenomenal field is precisely this. Like there is things are always interrelated. So whenever you talk about being, you're actually talking about interbeing. As long as you stay in the lived experience, you're actually talking about interbeing. So in order for you to have a figure, you need a ground. In order for you to have a figure and a ground, you need someone who kind of takes a certain attitude for there to be a certain figure and a ground. And in order for you to have someone who takes this attitude, you need a certain ground that propels that other into taking on a specific attitude. So it's the whole idea, the core idea is, and here I can maybe again revert to Henry Bortoft. He actually tries to develop what he calls dynamic thinking. So thinking dynamically, this is something that is very very closely related to what is usually conceived of talked about as this emptiness. It is precisely not falling into the pitfall of objectification, of reification. Objects are very very useful, pragmatically useful tools. This is why in Buddhism also they have conventional reality, because we gravitate towards that. And you cannot say that they are not real. I cannot say that this flask is not real. I cannot say that this cup of tea is not real. It is, but yet it isn't. Yeah, and it isn't precisely real in the sense of being self-enclosed something.
Right.
Something that has, as you put it, an essence. This is what I try to convey when I said that, like that one of the things that I usually associate with suffering is precisely this: the idea of mind being self-enclosed something and the world being self-enclosed something. This is precisely the problem. It isn't. So this does not mean that there is no me, that I am just empty in the sense of not being at all, in the sense of sheer and absolute nothingness. That's silly. Yeah, but it is true in the sense of my not being a self-enclosed entity with a distinct essence, because I'm basically always interrelated with the world and with other beings. So as you put it so nicely, and I think that this came we mentioned this on several occasions. Being is always, in a certain sense, interbeing, and awareness, stepping into this realm of awareness, is something that opens this up. When I was talking about the phenomenal field, entering into the phenomenal field gives you another perspective on things, because you realize how dynamically interwoven they are. It's a very simple exercise, yet a very profound exercise, as long as you allow it to actually teach you something, I think.
And another thing we haven't touched on yet is you mentioned this, speaking about consciousness as a emergent quality, and nowadays more and more you hear neuroscientists talking about the consciousness being a quality that is imbued in all things, not only human beings, not only animals, not only living beings, but actually it is a quality of nature. So bringing it into the realm of awareness, I'm curious about that, because this is often the case when we use terms, conventional terms like real or not real. We often create boundaries in our thinking, which then when they're extended, then we're talking past each other, as you said before. So what is consciousness if it's a quality that is present in all things? And what is the awareness of a hydrogen atom, for example, or what is and how does it relate to the awareness of our lived experience right here and right now? So I don't know if you
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be curious to go into that topic because you have these extremes of like consciousness is just a what do you like an epiphenomenon, right?
Mhm.
That it's just it's something just on the side, a byproduct of living, right? On one extreme,
Yeah.
you could say, and then on the other, that all things are consciousness only. So,
Okay, so the thing is, this is a very good example as to why I think that, why I mentioned that I think that this conceptual revolution or a reform needs to take place. It's really important because all of these approaches have one thing in common. They actually try to conceptualize consciousness in an object-like manner. So they try to, in a certain sense, reify it, and they either claim that, well, there you have the physical realm, and then what emerges is consciousness. So consciousness is again some some semi-object-like entity that emerges, or it is present everywhere. So you have physical entities, and then attached to them is some primitive form of consciousness. So that would be panpsychism. But again, you have this notion of the ultimate constituent of reality that is then kind of just you in addition to the physical objects, you have to add something to it, or you can say, well, this is all there is. And in this sense, I would say that the physical materialist approaches are basically more philosophically consistent, because they kind of stick to this idea of the objective world, and they try to they try to somehow make this work. These approaches where you on the surface level, they seem to be more appreciative of consciousness, but I would say they're not, because they basically distort consciousness and thereby make our conversations, our debates, our dialogues more confusing. So for example, the panpsychist approach, which would say, well, consciousness is basically the property of everything, simply adopts this objectivist conception of the universe and simply tries to add some primitive consciousness, whatever that is. The thing is, consciousness, in my view, needs to be understood in other terms, and the notion of field is more productive, more useful. Why? Because the field is conceived as a whole. So every segment of the field is interrelated to all the other segments in the field. When one changes, the other segments of the field have to change as well. And of course, you can adopt a certain stance and separate something pragmatically from the whole. And as long as you're aware as to what you're doing, so that that you have a certain figure, and of course you have a ground, but now you're not going to focus on the ground, you're just going to focus on the figure and see where interrelating certain figures brings you. Okay, this is a valid approach and can be very useful. But on the more ultimate, on the more fundamental level, this is a wrong way of looking at things, because things are dynamically interrelated, and consciousness, or awareness at least, this is why it's sometimes problematic to talk about consciousness. Maybe awareness or lived experience are new conceptual tools that might be used, because they people don't already think they know as to what they mean, so they're usually at least somewhat flabbergasted, and they're like, well, lived experience, what do you mean lived experience? Or awareness, it's a bit more. And awareness or lived experience are, I think, are better approached through the lens of notions such as field, dynamic system, things of that nature. Of course, these notions are also now present in science, but if you try to talk about them, they in a certain sense are more in tune with the proper dynamics of experience, of lived experience. When you go into it, and this relationship between the figure ground, the subject entering into this whole story, yeah, so that's my view. So that it's the approaches that perhaps seem to be more appreciative of consciousness are sometimes even more muddling the conceptual waters, because they simply try to make consciousness yet another object, a strange object, admittedly, but an object nonetheless. And we have to somehow fit it into this, scientific framework, which is fundamentally this like very, very simplistic, objectivist conception of the world.
Great.
It's kind of it's interesting. I was just going to say briefly that it's like believing in beliefs is, I think, a bit of the problem. I have a rationalist culture, because it's. I agree with everything you're saying. That's all, and that there's some like. It's always a better way of talking about things, but I always remember when like when Feplin was drawing the diagram of the consciousnesses in of Yogacara, drawing circles. Oh, I'm about to make my first mistake, right? Like as he's drawing the different circles, because the thing that we always emphasize is the practice.
Yeah.
So it's not just what you believe, but how you hold it. It's kind of like your comment about proving earlier, right? Because we could say all the time, like, oh, your boots are weatherproven, and when you're listening to sports, people say, oh, this goalkeeper's been proven in 12 confrontations with England. Nobody takes that to mean he won't give up a goal today or make a mistake. Just like if you say a theory's been proven, it just means like, well, so far the evidence that it's accumulated is consistent with it. If you hold it, in a reasonable way, humble way, and it's not really dangerous. The problem is just the fundamental lack of humility in the scientific enterprise, which new words won't get rid of. And somehow by adopting new words, you're just sort of fooling yourself. Now I have these. You can call your beliefs whatever you want to call them. You'll get attached to them anyways. Science believes all this. That our theories can be disproven and etc. And still everybody laughs at this quote of science advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
Despite the fact of all that, because it's the practice of letting go. There's no replacement for, and you can't do it conceptually. You can't believe anything that's going to make you be ready to let go of your beliefs.
Okay, but maybe I would just add to this that I think that what is a really valid enterprise at this moment is that we somehow try to figure out ways to think, talk, and cultivate modes of thinking that are more embedded in let's say the domain of our existence, in the domain of the lived experience. I sometimes talk about this as Euroboric thinking, thinking that is always going back to itself, like the Ouroboros, the snake of Ouroboros chasing its tail. And being aware of this is, in a certain sense, one aspect of this is definitely epistemic humility, because fundamentally your epistemic endeavors are groundless, and for this reason the task of like this bodhisattva, wow, the number of the creatures who are suffering is endless. I vow to free them all, or what have you. It's the same attitude here. I mean, of course, as soon as a certain conceptual something will emerge, it will become reified. I mean, people have reified Nagarjuna. If they're able to do that, then reify everything.
Exactly. And this is by putting Nagarjuna on the board, you're of course admitting that there are views that are more useful than others, right? So that when it's the first step of the practice, of course, the hand person of view. Like we're putting him up the board, not Skinner. But it's just knowing where that ends, right? Because it's just one element, right? It's like, okay, we can have a useful perspective. Then, of course, we need mindfulness to learn mindfulness. We need to learn concentration. We have a job that allows us to maintain that mindset, act right, etc. And then you can manage to maybe hold on to those, that non-attached mindset. But without all of those conditions arising, it's difficult to have beliefs and to let go of them or to hold them in a way that's not full of grasping.
Mhm.
And
Well, that,
it's not that.
and to remember that we are on a path of cultivation, right? So there is a deep aspiration to want to wake up to reality, to be kindly reduce harm in the world, and that we can hold the path of training with lightness, right? Without that with a humility that we don't necessarily know everything when we start out on the path of practice and when we are continuing on the path of practice, and so we can come back to our breathing, come back to our body, and do it again and again and again, but not become dogmatic about coming back to our breath, coming back to our breathing. You see what I mean? Because if we, because otherwise we throw out everything, right? We just say, okay, well, nothing matters, and because I don't want to be dogmatic, so nothing matters. But the Buddha is not saying that, and neither was Nagarjuna saying that, and I don't think we're saying that either. We're actually saying, no, there is a path of practice. There is a way to cultivate the kind of vision in the present moment, which is free from wrong views, which is it's free as possible, at least, from grasping at wrong perceptions and the story that we co-create of the world, which then goes out into the world in terms as action and as our thinking, our speech, and so forth. So so so
Guys, I actually think that,
releasing the dogma, but knowing there's a path.
yeah, I actually think that I like this second part of our talk even better.
Well, that's okay. We're recording it, so.
The other, because we, basically these are like continuation, very, very good extensions, additions to what we were talking. Basically, honing in on some of the things that we opened up, but we didn't really go into, and then.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way it always is, because they're difficult subjects to even get people, because it's for the community as well to kind of see this. It's like in the Buddhist community, I think it's those issues are interesting. Like, it's a subtle thing that there's all views are wrong views, but some are a lot more useful than others. Even for very experienced practitioners, that gets to be, and that's a big reason why we're excited to do these kinds of retreats, is because when we do believe that that there are, like, changing the scientific theories. It's not that every theory is equal. Like, if you make some influence on scientific theories, people are always going to start learning about the mind in some way, oftentimes intellectually, but there are definitely very very big differences in the usefulness of those ways of seeing things, as far as eventually getting to the truth. It's like all rafts are not created equal.
And some of them sink.
Yeah, some of them sink. Some of them you have no chance of getting to the other shore with that raft.
Yeah. But another point here is that saying this is always, in a certain sense, contextualized temporarily. So, for example, a raft that floats poorly now might be a really good raft after 200 years if the conditions of the world change. So, if for some reason things change drastically, that raft might turn out to be, so the form of that raft might be useful. So, I think that this is precisely this being aware of the. This is why I think it's so important to always think about certain, let's say, epistemic approaches, certain types of knowledge and modes of knowing in broader context, in the context of historicity, in the context of the general cultural sphere in which you're talking, in the situation in the world at large. There's so many. And I think that this is very, very profoundly interrelated to the idea of emptiness. Like, because, when we talk about the phenomenal field, we again simplify somewhat. This phenomenal field is imbued and sedimented with the meanings of the words that we use that go way back with our biological structures that have opened up specific ways of being in the world that we have no ideas about, and that change with new technologies and new insights. So it's a
You're,
dynamic thing.
you're in the right place. I mean, it's a new tradition. I saw at least saw this is real, that every there's 10,000 dhammas and you're always teaching things through skillful means, and skillful means change according to the culture. And so I saw that all sorts of things needed to change, from the practice to organization. So there's a lot of open-mindedness to how things have been done, and had the kind of solidity of this practice to say, I see these are the new skillful means, so I'm going to teach this way. A good place to be around that awareness.
Yeah.
Well, this is all really rich, but I'm really aware that I think I need to take a nap.
Yeah, exactly.
One of my conditionings in the monastery is to take, one of my elder brothers calls it a noble nap
A normal nap, huh?
in the afternoon. So today I sacrificed my noble nap to to be here, and this has been wonderful. I've learned so much, Sebastian. Thank you so much.